So many, many moons ago, as a congregation, we were journeying through the book of First Kings. Doesn't it seem like that? It was like we just left it for a week to do Easter, but it feels like it's been months upon months. So last we left the story in First Kings, there was a drought in the northern kingdom of Israel, and really probably in the whole region. And if you remember, God had told Elijah, it's going to be all right, I'm going to feed you by ravens. And then he sent him to the northern area of Sidon, into enemy territory, into the northern place that worshipped Baal. And Elijah was dependent upon a widow and her son for his sustenance. And he watched God do amazing things there. And we said that part of that was God was building Elijah's faith for something that was coming. Well, the thing that was coming is what we're going to talk about today. A pretty famous story in the Bible that if you've been in the church for a little bit, you're probably a little familiar with. But it's important for us to kind of dig into it and understand. What's going to happen is there's going to be a grand face-off between God and Baal, and we're going to see who wins. Surprise, surprise. God wins, right? 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to read the first couple verses and then skip down a little bit. It says, after a long time, in the third year, so we're 3 years into this drought now, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Remember, Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and he supplied them with food and water. And Ahab had said to Obadiah, go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can gather some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals. Great king, right? Concerned about the horses and the mules, not his people. So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction, Obadiah in the other. And as Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him. He bowed down to the ground and said, is it really you, my lord Elijah? Yes, he replied. Go and tell your master Elijah is here. We're going to skip down to verse 16. We're skipping over paragraphs where Obadiah is nervous to tell the king on behalf of Elijah for a couple of reasons. Verse 16, but Obadiah went to meet Ahab, and he told him. And Ahab went to meet Elijah. And when he saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, you troubler of Israel? I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your family have. You've abandoned the Lord's commands, and you have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel, assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people, and he said, how long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. The people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls, prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. They called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy, or maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's sleeping, and you just have to awaken him." So they shouted louder, and they began to slash themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. And he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it a third time. Then water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench he dug. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and it licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Then when all the people they saw this, then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of heavy rain." So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. The word of God for the people of God. So we're 3 years into this drought, and God speaks to his prophet and says, "Go to the king and let him know rain is coming." All we know is that this is what God has told Elijah. We're not certain that God has told Elijah any of the other specifics that happen in this story, though likely it is the case. And so as Elijah goes off, we can sort of break up this chapter into 2 bigger portions. At the beginning, we have Elijah's interaction with Obadiah, and then we have the big scene that is the face-off between God and Baal. But I don't want to miss the significance of Elijah's interaction with Obadiah, because something profound is being told us by the storyteller in this section. He's letting us know that even in the midst of drought, even in the midst of struggle, God is still active. God is still working. God is still not just present, but moving. That is, that God's faithfulness and His graciousness is on display even in the midst of what would appear to most onlookers as His absence. We believe this as Christians, do we not? That even in the hardest of times, God is active at work in His fidelity, in His faithfulness, and in His graciousness. Why? The same reason as He was here. To redeem, and to call His people back to Himself for their good and for His glory. So, how do I see this in these beginning verses? Well, there's four things that are present in the midst of drought that the storyteller wants us to know are present. Otherwise, there's no point in giving these verses here. The first is the drought itself. Now, listen, this is a bit of backwards logic, right? The drought seems to appear to be the absence of God's blessing, and yet we are constantly told throughout Scripture that God invites these moments in order to not just grab the attention of His people, but to work in their heart to call them back to allegiance and fidelity to Him. These are not first and foremost punishments so much as they are the withdrawal of God in order to re-grab the attention of His people. And the truth is that sometimes this happens in our life. We would be wrong to suggest that every bad thing that happens to us is God's effort to get our attention. We live in a broken world where bad things happen. But sometimes, and certainly in this story, God is doing something of this profound nature in order that the people would know, return, and respond. So the drought is actually an act of God's faithfulness, and it's actually an act of His grace. We're told in Romans by the Apostle Paul that it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. Well, there's three other things that show God's faithfulness and grace. The second thing is Elijah, right? That in the midst of this drought, God has not removed His voice from His people. That Elijah is the means by which the voice of God is being spoken to the people. Now, it's bad enough to have drought in the land. Imagine if the voice of God was completely removed from the people. And yet, in His grace, God has raised up Elijah so that he can continue to speak to the people and offer them an alternate way to the one the king of Israel, Ahab, and his wife Jezebel are proposing and leading them down. The third way that we see God's fidelity and His grace, His presence in this story, is the existence of other prophets of God. It's a fascinating little parenthetical statement that is put in there for significance, right? One of the things Obadiah is doing is preserving other prophets of God. So that there are at least 100 of them, but we know there were at least at some time more because Jezebel was killing them regularly. She's not a good queen, friends, right? And so think about this with me for just a second. Sometimes it's the spotlighted agent of God who gets all the publicity and all the press, isn't it? We look at this story and we think, man, Elijah, what a hero. Well, do not forget all of the other faithful prophets who refused to turn their back on God at the cost of their lives. To Elijah, God said, I'm going to send you away. To the other prophets, He said, actually, I'm going to ask you to stay in the midst of this. Imagine the blessing that is to the faithful remnant in Israel who is worshiping Yahweh, that God has kept amongst them faithful leaders and prophets, pastors for them. What a tremendous blessing. And then the fourth reality of God's presence, His grace, and His fidelity is in what Obadiah himself symbolizes, right? It is that there is a faithful remnant of people. Now, reading up to this point in the story, we would have concluded, I believe, hey, there's no one left in Israel who is following God. Everyone is compromised. And then we meet this guy, with a crazy name, Obadiah, right? And it says he was fully devoted to God. Amazing. Again, friends, sometimes when we're looking for God's blessing, we not only look to the spotlighted, but we look to the religious people who hold religious offices, right? And God, in fact, is working through everyone. Visit Obadiah is not a prophet. He's not a priest. He's not a pastor, a missionary, or an evangelist. He holds a job. He's a regular guy in the economy of the world. And it's through him that God is actually preserving his witness of these 100 prophets. That is that while Obadiah did not hold a religious office, he was no less called than the 100 prophets or Elijah himself. There is a sacredness in all vocations, and God had providentially and perfectly placed Obadiah exactly where he needed him in that moment to sustain his witness to his people. This is who God is. It is easy for us to read the headlines, to go out every day and think, my vegetables aren't growing because there's a drought in the land. Proverbially, whatever that means for you in this life. But if you have eyes that know and love God, you will see all around you profound ways in which God is active and present, even when it seems like no one is following God and God appears to be absent. Think about this story translated into our current existence. That yes, sometimes God does use profound challenges in order to call us back to himself. But no matter the circumstances of this world, and if you read the headlines and listen to talk radio and watch cable news, this next decision that someone makes is going to be the end of the universe or whatever, It's the world we live in. It's profoundly worse than drought in many ways. And I don't mean that to demean the problems are real. And so it's easy to be overwhelmed by all of this and think, God, you are absent. But think about it like this for me, in the same way that Elijah was present as God's mouthpiece, we have a greater Elijah, Jesus, the true and perfect Word of God, who shows us in his risen rule who God is. And what's more, God has given us a profound gift in the Scriptures of his written Word. That is, that God is speaking to us, if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, with regularity in this world. Who are you listening to? And God has provided for us spiritual leaders and spiritual mentors who are trying to live counterculturally in honor of God and not in honor of these things. How amazing that we have teachers and pastors and community group leaders and mentors and disciplers. But do not lose the significance of Obadiah, who is named by name when the prophets are not. That is that you, yes, you, have a significant role to play in this world for the glory of God. You are an agent of God's faithfulness and grace for his kingdom and for this world. That though you might not hold religious title in the church or religious office in your vocation, you are no less called than me or any other. And your vocation is equally sacred. And God has providentially placed you in just the right place for those who are in need of what you have to offer. Do you believe that? Do you believe that a palace administrator in the worst king in the history of Israel's court could subversively be working kingdom good for God? If that's true, how much more you in your place of business, in your particular neighborhood, in your spheres of influence? God is up to something always, and you're part of it. Amazing. Well, all of this leads to the giant standoff, right? As God says to Elijah, all right, I'm ready to end the drought. I'm going to bring rain. And Elijah I believe because of what he's seen God do through roadkill deliveries from the ravens and lots of bread from the widow who had nothing left, and then ultimately seeing God raise to life this widow's daughter, the faith of Elijah is multiplying. And so when God says, hey, you're going to go face to face with the king, who we now know parenthetically has been killing all the prophets, right? And you're going to say, hey, it's going to rain. And Elijah does it. Now, we're not privy to the inner negotiations of Elijah's heart and mind or the conversations that went on between him and God. My guess is in his human nature, there was at least some of that, yeah? But when it was time for the rubber to meet the road, Elijah moves in bold faith to not just confront the king, but to set up a massive face-off between Baal and God. Now, what are the purposes for this face-off? And we can see a couple of them in this storyline. The first purpose of this face-off is that God intends to declare that he is God over the whole world. You say, well, I don't remember reading. What verse is that in? Well, notice where this face-off is going to take place. Mount Carmel. You say, well, it doesn't mean anything to me. Yeah, me either, right? But it meant something to people who followed Baal, because that was his sacred mountain. That was his spot. A mountain a range up and against the Mediterranean Sea. And notice that there had been an altar to God there that Elijah was going to rebuild. There was a time when, as Israel filled the land, they had reclaimed that space for God, and now God is after it again. Is that this amazing moment doesn't happen in the temple of God in Jerusalem. It doesn't happen in some isolated spot where all of the remnant is there and has kept holy. This moment happens right in the middle of enemy territory. Why? Because God is not just God over spaces we've made sacred. He's God over the whole world. All of it is his. Dutch prime minister and great theologian named Abraham Kuyper once said it this way: there is not 1 square inch of this world over which God does not stand and say, mine. And here we have it again. That God is saying over Mount Carmel, it's actually mine. Amazing. But the purpose is even more so to shake the people enough to get their attention and move them back to an allegiance to God. Now, if you remember, what God has told Elijah is, I'm going to bring rain. He didn't say to Elijah, hey, set up a major face-off, deliver offerings, and fire will come down on which one. Now, he may have told Elijah that privately. It seems like that's true because Elijah says he's doing everything God commanded him, right? But wouldn't it have just been easier to come in to the area to announce rain and then for rain to fall down? I mean, that would have proven the point, right? Except God knows the hearts of people and how divided our hearts are and how easy it is for us to give gratitude, to give rationality and reason to the wrong things. So rain falls and the people would go, well, it could have been God, or it could have been Baal, or maybe it was just coincidence or happenstance. You ever think like that in your life? You're praying for something and it happens and you're like, oh, thank you, God. Or well, maybe that was just coincidence. Or that was just this. We're fickle as people. And so Elijah is going to set up something that at some level is meant to be undeniable and move the people. In fact, Elijah addresses the heart and the nature of the people before the face-off. He says, listen, no longer can you people sway between opinions. Did you catch that language in there? In other words, like, God, Baal, whoever, this massively divided thing. Well, if you translate that literally from the Hebrew, the language would actually be no longer can you limp around on crutches. Right? And the idea is that these people have become so weakened by their idolatry. They've become so compromised that they're just, like chaff blown by the wind. And Elijah says, no more. You're going to see God for who he is, and you're going to be forced to make a decision for yourself. And of course, you can see the limpness of the people. And when Elijah says this very thing, do you catch what it says? It says, and the people said nothing. Oh, okay. And Elijah says, we're going to have this big face-off. And the people are like, well, that sounds good to us, whatever. Sure. So you get this nature of what's going on here, this malaise that is over the people and their spiritual dividedness. And so the face-off is set up. A couple of things to note about this. The first is that Elijah and God necessarily stack the deck, right? And not for themselves. They stack the deck for Baal to win. Again, meaning to make this as provable as possible. So you have one prophet of God, and you have 450 prophets of Baal. You have two offerings, but who gets to choose the bull they want to use first? The prophets of Baal. Inspect it, choose the one they figure is better. Plus, they get to go first. So if their God answers first, then Elijah doesn't even have an opportunity. And then, what's more, Elijah, when he builds his altar, drenches it in water. You're asking yourself, where does the water come in a 3-year drought? Fair question. Maybe it's salt water from the Mediterranean Sea that's not drinkable, or maybe King Ahab has plenty of reserves that he's holding back from the people. We don't know. But no matter what, everything is stacked in this contest in order for Baal to win. So that when God shows himself, it is eminently indisputable that God is God and Baal is not. Now look with me for a second how this contest goes on, because it is significant for us. How do the prophets of Baal attempt to get Baal to respond to them? It says they go on a massive prayer blitz, right? From morning till noon, they are chanting, and they're dancing, and they're repeating, and they're saying all kinds of things. As they're going through all of their religious ceremonies and rites, they're doing all the things they know they need to do in order to get their God's attention. Because for religious people of any religion, right? And I'll distinguish what I mean by religion in a second. The idea is that we have to get God's attention. We have to prove to him that what we're asking of him, we're worthy to get. And so they go on and on and on in this way, proving to Baal who they are. What's more, they understood in their mythology and their understanding of gods that Baal was not omnipresent, that is, everywhere all at once. He could be doing something else. That's why Elijah taunts him appropriately. Hey, maybe he's busy. Maybe he's on the road, traveling. That wouldn't have been as humorous to us as it was to them. They would have thought to themselves, oh yeah, he might be. Let's yell louder. He's right. There's this sense in which the gods that people worshipped then were fickle, were capricious, were consumed by other things. Sometimes they were for you, sometimes they weren't. That's why you had to bribe them and pay them off. That's why you had to perform for them so they'd do for you what you wanted. And this is happening over and over and over again. So Elijah begins to taunt them, right? Well, maybe you're not talking loud enough. Just do it louder. Well, maybe you're not repeating long enough. Maybe more repetition will get it done. Maybe you're not dancing jubilantly enough. And they get so into it, it says they begin to pull out their swords and their spears and cut and slash themselves. What's that all about? Well, it says that was part of their custom, and that's true. The reality is that this was a way, the greatest way for them to prove to their God that they were serious about this. They were bleeding for him, that this was significant. And of course, the story tells us that at every twist and turn, no response, no one heard, no one was moved. And then you turn to Elijah and you ask, well, what did he do? No long chanting, no dancing, thank goodness, right? As a non-dancer, I'm always grateful when a person of God is not asked to dance. I'm like, no chanting, no dancing, no slashing of himself, right? He just goes over and begins to rebuild an altar. Fascinating. And catch the language that is being used. He pulls 12 stones. Why? Because there are 12 tribes of Israel that God has designated. What is he doing? He's calling upon the promises of God. He's reminding the people and himself of the covenant that God has made. This is all about God, not about religious performance. You see the difference that's going on here? And then he turns to him and he offers a simple prayer, right? And we know that this is the breadth of the prayer because if anything else was of significance to make the offering successful, it would have been recorded. And he says, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why would he say that? It's all about covenant language, isn't it? That God has made a covenant with Abraham that from this one man there's going to be a great nation. They're now the recipients of that promise. Isaac was the beginning of the fulfillment. Jacob was the even bigger beginning of the fulfillment. It was Jacob's sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. That is that not just for himself, but for the good of the people, Elijah is rightly situating Israel in the promises of God, not in religious performance. Do you see this? This is profoundly significant. And then listen to how he prays. God, so that the people will know you are God, would you do this? Not, God, so that I can have, will you do this? In other words, God, would you show these people your glory and your bigness? In other words, reveal yourself. In other words, this prayer is asking God to show himself to people, not asking God to give something to me personally. Do you see this? Do you see the very, very different religious versus God-centered worship, prayer, whatever? Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. For so many of us, we find ourselves, even as followers of Jesus, trapped in a religious cycle. And it is as equally unsuccessful as it is equally frustrating, isn't it? Imagine being the prophets of Baal in this moment. Okay, the first 15 minutes go by, you're dealing okay. You're now an hour in. How are you feeling? 2 hours in? Now it's lunchtime. You're hungry. You've been dancing for 3 hours. That sounds horrific, doesn't it? Now you're like, oh, great. We've got to pull out the swords and the spears to really prove ourselves here. Have you ever found yourself in this cycle with God? Well, I'm praying as hard as I can. I'm doing the things. I'm going to church. I'm doing all the things, and God's not answering me. I got to double down. I got to do more hard. I got to prove to him that I'm worthy of this thing. That's not the method, friends. Can I tell you something? Yes, God answers Elijah's prayer in the affirmative, right? We know how the story ends. But he very well could have answered Elijah's prayer in the negative, and it would have been okay. It is that the prayer Elijah offers that says, God, I'm trusting you to show yourself to your people in this moment, is a prayer of handing over the decision-making to God himself. Stunning, right? Listen, this doesn't mean you can't pray for things you need, but think about it for just a second. If you pray really hard, that is not changing God's mind. And listen, I'm not trying to tell you to shorten your prayer times. It's not the point of any of this. I'm saying, what if you went about engaging with God on a covenant basis? Say, God, I'm your child. It is right for me to put myself in your hands. I look around this world and it feels like to many people you're absent. Would you show yourself to them? Would you reaffirm my faith by delivering for me in this moment? Prayer is significant, but there are different ways to go about it. Religion says you have to prove yourself to God if you're going to have a chance at him giving you what you want. Covenant-based worship or prayer says God has already proven himself to you, so you can trust him to give you what you need. You see the very difference? And here we have Elijah demonstrating this for the people. Amazing. It says fire comes down from heaven and it consumes not just the offering, but the stones and the ground and sops up all the water. Amazing. Miraculous. Stunning. If we look back into the Old Testament, we can see the reality that when fire comes from heaven, it is meant to show an affirmative reception of the offering of the people by God. Because God says, accepted. And so we now know that this story is not just about Israel or Elijah asking for God to do something, but it is actually an offering of atonement and repentance for the sins of the people and their idolatry. And God accepts it. And therefore, on the basis of it, Elijah says there's sounds of heavy rain in the distance. That is that God is going to bring new life again to his people and the land. God is the true God. He is not capricious. He is not fickle. He is not otherwise occupied. Isn't that good news to you, friends, this morning? Our God is both omnipotent and omnipresent, all-powerful, and in all places at all times. There is no call waiting. There is no holds. There is no busy signals. That when you speak to God, he hears you instantly and looks upon you in favor because he loves you. You do not have to convince him that you are worthy to be heard. But big part of prayer is convincing your soul that God is worthy to be trusted. Do you see the difference? God is bigger than Baal, the true God. God over the whole earth. Mount Carmel is his in the same way that Bethlehem and Allentown and Emmaus and Phillipsburg and Nazareth and everywhere else are his. And he desires to show himself. And nowhere more profoundly has God done this than in the person and work of Jesus. Where is Jesus in this story? Jesus is the greater Elijah. Think about Elijah for just a minute. In utter boldness of faith, he walks into the mess of the world that is the kingdom of Israel to verbally confront the power who was ruling the people wrongly, and announces that God is somehow going to show up miraculously to regather his people around himself and bring new life to them. This is the gospel, isn't it? That Jesus came into the mess of this world to stand up to Satan and the powers of sin and death, announcing that God was going to do something profoundly miraculous in their midst. And Jesus didn't just rebuild an altar and put a bull on it. He laid himself down as the ultimate sacrifice. And the greatest fire from heaven ever recorded is when that stone was rolled away from the tomb of Jesus, announcing God had accepted the ultimate sacrifice. And a new week of new creation was underway for God's people. That is, the sound of heavy rain was in the distance. Life for me and for you, the sustenance that our souls long for and need. You and I, we can picture what Mount Carmel may have looked like. But on a different hill, the ultimate sacrifice was made. It was accepted by God. And therefore, people like us with divided hearts, wandering around limp and on crutches because of our brokenness and sinfulness, looking for help in anywhere we could find it, running after lesser gods, engaging in the rat race of religious performance, trying to find life, something that will bring us out of this drought. God steps right in Jesus in order to deliver us and to bring new life. And if that has been true for you, then you are part of the faithful remnant in this world. We will go on next week. I keep, doing spoilers, sorry. We'll go on next week to find out that this revival doesn't take for everyone. There are many who reject it, including, stunningly, to Elijah, King Ahab and his wife. It's going to do a number on Elijah. We'll talk about that next week. But it then becomes incumbent not just for Elijah and for the faithful prophets, but for those who have recentered themselves around the true God to live in fidelity, counterculturally for God in that kingdom, claiming new space once again for God, rebuilding altars for God in this land. And so too it is for you. Newsflash. Jesus died and was resurrected, and a whole bunch of people have rejected that. But you have experienced the true life from it. And so as you go from here, Obadiah, in whatever vocation that God has uniquely and providentially placed you, what would it mean to live as His ambassador because of His great victory?